Hi, welcome back to another TerranScapes video. Today I'm happy to be able to show you the completed ruins of Amon Sul and the completed mountain to proxy Weathertop to receive the ruins. And if you haven't seen the videos that I've done of those before, you might want to take a look back. I've got a couple videos showing some of the work in progress of these pieces and discussing some of the design considerations that went into them. So I'm going to try to not retread over old ground, but just show you some of the work that's been done and a couple of the touches that I haven't gone over in the previous videos. One of the things that's difficult about showing you this, however, is its incredible size. I had a lot of trouble photographing these pieces together because of their size. So what I think I'm going to do is show you some stills of them completed, all together assembled, and give a little description of that, and then show you some close-ups with the video camera, and I can talk about some of the up-close details a little bit better with a little bit better lighting. Because of its large size, I had some trouble throwing enough light on it all as one piece, and this camera is very sensitive to bad lighting, so rather than try to show you a yellow mountain or an orange mountain, I'd rather show you up close quality color and then give you some stills that I can a little bit better color correct. So first, let's take a look at the whole piece so you can get a sense of its size and scale, and then we'll talk about it up close in detail.
So as we pan back from the overview top of the mountain, you can see with the ruins centered on the upper back half of the mountain that there's plenty of room in the front of the slope for models to ascend. And here, looking at a still shot of the front, you can see some of the gullies that have been carved into the front of it, and the overall, off-centered, pushback top of the plateau without the ruins on top. And here you have a view of the rear of the mountain, which has the large cliff facing and the ruins placed on top. And on the left and the right of the ruins, you can see a path that ascends to the rear of the plateau, allowing miniatures to ascend to the top via that route. And this side shot shows that one of the side paths going up around the sides, and that path should be accessible to miniatures coming from the front of the mountain, and it probably traverses 20 or so inches around the side of the mountain in its entirety and varies on both sides. And lastly, here's a shot close-up with some miniatures included for scale. So the hobbits are in the ruins, the 4 ring wraiths are ascending up the front slope, and Aragorn is entering from the rear using the side path. This gives you a sense of the overall size of the models compared to the miniatures, and showcases that the model should be stable over large areas of the terrain.
So here you see a slightly closer view of the ruins. I've added in a few miniatures from the Lord of the Rings to sort of give you a sense of scale and how many can fit in there. Couple things of note. I did go around the edges and add in some static grass along the base where the soil is. And then, sort of to give you a contrast view here, a little bit pulled away, what I did is I went on the interior and added in some static grass with a slightly drier look. I blended in a slightly, tannish, yellowish color to the static grass to separate it a little bit. Maybe if I pull back a little bit, there we go, you can get more of a sense of that. To separate it from the grass on the outside, thinking, fill in the blank, the evils of the ruins have, caused the grass to suffer, or it's growing on rocks and it doesn't do quite as well. But that's sort of an idea, just to kind of bring a little bit of a different interest to the interior of the piece. The whole piece has been weathered down with some powders, and it actually got muted a little bit when I applied some matte clear coats to it to protect it and to seal the weathering powders in. They're still present, but not quite as prominent as I had maybe hoped for, so that's something to think about maybe for the future. Maybe it requires a couple extra coats, a little stronger initially, or even a coat after the clear coat's been applied. The quick tip for weather powdering selection is I originally went with a darker color to match the sort of darker, ruddier color of the stonework, and in the end I found that picking a color of weathering powder that was a little closer to the highlight color actually made a little bit more visual sense, and so I think going with the highlight color is the way to go rather than trying to pick the base color of the model that you're trying to weather. And you will also notice that for thinking color selection wise, that I attempted to try to set the ruins off from the base stonework. All the rocks around the edges have been painted to match the mountain, and by picking a color that was a little bit more red, brown, a little bit darker for the ruins themselves, sets it off from the rocks and doesn't make it look like it's all sort of one piece coming up out of the ground. It helps, I think, because it's a man-made structure, set it apart a little bit. I also added in some vines around some of the spots, not too many. I picked this sort of fall vines. I forget what the exact name from these are from Scenic Express, the Silflor line, but I like sort of the dead leaves that are part of the vines, and then I took a few of those leaves and scattered them on the interior, and I'll show you that in a second. And here you can see a close-up of the interior of the ruins, and scattering in, a little bit of those leaves, and then I've sort of glued them in place, a little drop of dilute PVA, hold them down, but they really, I think, bring quite a bit of life to the interior of the model, give it a little bit of, things blowing around in a dry interior look. Did add in a few clumps of, upright tufts of grass. And importantly, what I did is, you can see these two bushes here. These are the original bushes that were molded into the ruins as part of the actual piece itself. And rather than try to paint them, what I decided to do instead was to actually just foliage right over them, and I think that's going to tie it in a little more naturally to the rest of the vegetation on the mountain, and avoids the sort of awkward painted bush versus real bush look that could happen if I had tried to paint the pieces themselves. And here you can get a little up close look at some of the effects on the stonework, and you can see some of the weathering powder in some of the cracks and crevices. Well, like I said, it was a little bit more predominant before I did the sealing of the piece, so something to consider in the future, perhaps going a little bit heavier on it. I also went in and tried to model the actual stonework a little bit using the airbrush, but as I've said probably in past videos if you followed them, I tend to try to err on the side of subtlety rather than go overly strong. So places where I've blown, well, let me see if I can get my finger out of the way here, where I've put in some patches of green, a little mossy color look, some brighter colors, a little higher amount of weathering powder in a couple spots to sort of make it look a little uneven. I've gone for, again, something a little subtle but hopefully noticeable to the sort of subconscious to keep it a little bit more natural looking. Oh, excuse me for my awkward panning here. And just taking a little look at one of the exterior walls here to give you a sense of how the exterior has been finished. I have gone in and tried to, muddy up a little bit along the bottom. Again, going for something subtle. You can see a little bit of how the foliage looks up close on the vines here. And try to just breathe a little bit of dimensionality into the walls. Could be almost a little bit stronger. I think in the future I could try for something a little bit more aggressive, but I didn't want to take away from the actual rock appearance, and it might be something, I don't know, as a potential in the future, perhaps going in, painting it a little bit darker with the airbrush, and then going in and actually dry brushing over that lightly to pick back up that rock texture that you're going to lose with a little bit of the overpainting from the brush. But overall, I really like the way it's come out, and I think it's probably one of the best exteriors that I've painted to date. I'm really proud with the way it had come out. Of particular interest, and I'm going to show you this a little bit more on the mountain, but the static grass has been applied with a static grass gun, a static grass applicator, and that has really breathed a lot of life into the static grass. It could be more dominantly seen if it was a slightly taller grass, as this is only 2 millimeter, but I've noticed right away a change using a static grass applicator, and I'll show you a couple points on the mountain that I think are a little bit more easy, it's a little bit easier to see some of those effects. But this gives you a sense of how the ruins have come out, and a couple different angles to look at of that. So here you see a view of the front of the mountain. So when it's assembled, this represents the front slope, and the very edge of the ruins are at the top here, spanning backwards towards the the other half that is not on the table because it doesn't fit. You can see some of the rock outcroppings that I had mentioned in a previous video that I had pushed, or sealed in with some sculpt mold, and you can see now that the transition looks, very, very natural. It's very, seamless transition between the soil and the rocks. I did go back in and sprinkle a little sand loosely over some areas and then seal that in, and I'll show you a close-up of that in a minute, and I think that's really worked well to blend these areas in. And of course you can see some of the ravines that I've cut into this, some of the erosional gullies, to try to give it a little bit more of a natural undulation along the surface, and of course the various scatterings of vegetation. Let's take a little bit closer look at some of these features though. So taking a closer look at that rock clump, you can see how, by sprinkling in a little sand after the rocks have been put in place and most of the surface has been coated, it just really gave it a very nice natural feel. A lot of railroad layout, hobbyists will do this, and even though it takes a little more extra work based on the style, the way I paint my soil, it, I think, really blends a lot of realism into the clumps, and it was, I think, a very valuable addition overall to it. You may notice, the clumps spaced out at various points here, and what I've tried to do is actually identify some of the worst places stability-wise on the piece, and then use vegetation to help buffer models that are placed in those areas to give them an additional perch to sit on. Give you an idea here. So these are designed to sort of help models sit upright on some of the worst spots on the slope. Going back over and picking up some of these ring wraiths, I actually had been using a single ring wraith as my test pieces during the assembly and carving of this, and what I discovered is that the ring wraiths actually vary quite a bit in their overall style. This ring wraith, for instance, here has an incredibly, look at how far back he is on the base, and with the sweeping cloak, his center of gravity is incredibly tippy backwards, so he's going to be a real challenge to place on a variety of spots on the mountain and not have him be tippy. A slight change in his facing, whoopsie, he's a tricky one. Slight change in his facing, though, can yield quite a bit more stability for him. But then again, these clumps have been placed in some areas to help you prop up models as you play, even though these areas may be excessively unbalanced. The models will fit better on those spots and should allow for play over, at least 80% of the surface for almost any model, and more for models that are plastic or have a better center of gravity. As I said, some of these, I was really surprised at their variations between the different ring wraiths. And so, you may need a quarter inch of flexibility when you're playing on the mountain to allow for models to move slightly over into a more stable place. You see the difference there? Just a quarter inch of movement, and, well, it's probably more like a half inch of movement, and you suddenly can find a spot that's stable. So it's one of the challenges of making a natural topography for miniature gameplay as opposed to, say, railroad diorama. Gameplay is a component that is harder to integrate into more natural settings. So here we can see the side of the mountain. So this was the left piece of the previous shot. So what I've done is rotate it and added one of the back corners, and now you can get a sense of the slope that I've integrated along the side of the mountain to allow miniatures to access the back or the rear of where the ruins would be situated, which is here on this piece. The ruins actually sit almost predominantly on the back half of the section, and I think they can fit on it exclusively if you wanted to, but I've designed it to sort of just lap over this edge section here. So because of this gradual slope here, I had to raise this vertically here, which I've mentioned before, and you can see now the finished rock cliff face as it spans across the side. I had a viewer who seen a previous video and had mentioned the possibility of overlapping rocks at this kind of an area to avoid the strong seam that can happen between the casts. And one of the problems with that is that you're going to have let me see if I can demonstrate this differently. If I have the rocks overlapping, you know, like this, let's say, this is going to be a very fragile edge as it's going to be cut off on the back unless I jigsaw the actual foam behind it. And quite frankly, I just didn't have the time to do that kind of extensive foam work on a piece like this, and having the rocks overhang by themselves, it's way too much of a hazard for chipping or breaking. So one of the compromises is to have a seam that can be maybe a little stronger than desired, but you know, the project itself is so extensive and took you know, a little over budget for my time-wise on it, but I couldn't help myself, that really, in the end, some compromise is going to have to be made, and I was willing to sacrifice a little bit on the seams to add in some of the fantastic rock work that I thought was really going to be the eye-catching part of this piece. And here I just wanted to give you a little close-up of the actual static grass that was applied. One of the things that I tried very hard with the static grass on this piece was to add variations not only in the density of the clumps, but overall have areas that were, let me see if I can pan out, you can see, here we go, areas that are thinner as well. The static grass applicator, it's a scooter stick, and I'm going to do a video on it later on, but it really allows you to vary the static grass application in some unique ways, and most importantly, helps that static grass to stand up, making some of these tiny individual clumps just look so much more realistic. I was really psyched with how that effect really improved the overall look of static grass, and it's sort of going to be a standard issue for any future static grass work that I do. It made me actually think about adding static grass to some other boards and having it stand up, as I think between static grass and flock as a combo is going to produce some very interesting effects. But anyway, this gives you a chance to see some of those variations I was able to achieve in the grass, which I think adds so much more realism to the overall piece as a whole. And here you can get a little sense of a close-up of some of the rock work that was done. Again, these were all soft cast into place, so these are large molds that were placed in place before the plaster had time to harden, and that allowed me to sort of, you know, here you can see an example of come around the corner with a couple pieces and give a very nice transition to the overall, you know, I should say rather a better conformity of the rocks to the layout of the land, rather than, you know, having, you know, tight angles, which still occurred in a couple spots. It's just difficult with some areas you can see here. Not that I think this is an imperfection. I really like the way this looks, but it does show you where some angles can still occur. You can't have everything bend perfectly around. And in fact, I think that variation helps the piece so that you don't have, you know, everything look the same. Variation in nature is really the key. And here, as a final look, we can see the rear of the mountain. So this piece was on the left in the previous shot, and now I have rotated it 90 degrees and then added the other back half. Again, because I set the ruin so far back, the entire backside has been cliffed all the way across the back, splitting it, you know, in a couple areas to account for a ramp coming up on either side. And I've tried to add some variation between the appearances of those two, just to keep the mountain from looking a little bit too symmetrical. And I think you can get a sense of that here, where, you know, there's a gap coming through here, and on this side the rocks carry around a little bit more with some more, a little more aggressive erosional gullies on that side. Overall, though, the way these rocks came together to create this cliff face, I think came out fantastic in terms of enough of the different casts to produce enough variation so that it doesn't look like a repeating pattern overall on the rocks. A couple different applications of the molds and a couple different orientations and different kinds of contours they're conforming to really breaks it up and creates a very nice, very realistic mountainside. And here's a little close-up of some of those rocks from the backside here. And you can see, you know, I've tried to add in a couple flat areas and then add in a little bit of talus and whatnot, and then a little bit of a couple clumps of static grass, not too much, but something to just break up that overall gray coming from the top to the bottom and give it, you know, the sense that small plants are trying to eke out a living amongst the cracks and the crags of it. Again, there is going to be a seam here because of that, compromise that I mentioned before. And while some work could be done to improve that overall, the scope of the project is so large, and really, I was already way over the amount of time that I had promised the customer I would spend on this project, that I had to make some compromises somewhere, and I think overall the compromises are in my opinion, the right ones to make. That gives you a little sense of how that cliff looks running down the side, and again you can see here some of that variation in that static grass where I can gradually thin some areas out, have some more irregular patches where it's thinner, really try to break that up and give it a very, very natural feel. So hopefully you've enjoyed taking a look at this project. It's been a very unique project for me. Quite a few new techniques, even a new tool, static grass applicator, and definitely a new scale of size of projects. Probably the single largest terrain piece I've built to date, not counting, say, a modular board set, but I think this has a lot of unique properties that really set it apart from that kind of a project. I will have photos of this piece up on the website by the time this goes up, so I encourage you to take a look at those photos, and I'll put a link down in the description below. And of course, I always welcome comments and questions. I'm happy to address those, and keep your eye on the channel. I've got some more videos coming out now that the new year is past and the holidays are done. Hopefully things will return to a little bit more of a normal schedule, and I'll be able to produce them a little bit more regularly. So thanks once again for joining me, and if you have any questions or comments, you can always email me also, Mike@TerranScapes.com. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.